So that's the background introductions. It is now time for me to turn to my co-chair and for us to switch from framing the background information and the schedule of the breaks and so forth to Cajun cooking. Greg, over to you. Thanks.
Good morning, Mark, and thank you. Let Melvin switch over to my first slide. So when I thought about our task for this meeting and tried to boil that down to very few words, I would summarize our task with this question: is there a real-world evidence recipe? And to get us started on that task, I would like to bring you some guidance from the Food and Drug Administration. That would, however, be from the Food and Drug Administration of Louisiana. Now, down in Louisiana, at what we call the Food and Drug Unit, we have not forgotten that our first name be Food. Our mama called us Food for a reason, and we is disappointed that y'all been having days of meetings and have not yet said a word about food. Now, down in Louisiana, our statutory responsibilities include food. Let me magnify that for you, especially including the regulation of your gumbos and your étouffées. Now, in regulating the gumbo, we have learned a lot about this real-world evidence. And you might be asking me, what does real-world evidence have to do with gumbo? Well, it has several things. One of those be, they're both popular topics, and the question come up, can you call anything gumbo? Can you call anything real-world evidence? And just like your real-world evidence depends on your data, your gumbo all depends on your roux. In you making your gumbo, there are some ingredients you cannot or should not even try to control. And just like the observational comparisons in real-world evidence, when it comes to gumbo, we never stop arguing about whether you can have tomatoes. So let me spell some of those things out for you. Gumbo and real-world evidence, those are popular words these days, and people want to call everything that. And it is true that in your gumbo, they have all kinds of meats and all kinds of spices. We are all about biodiversity down in Louisiana. If it crawls or swims or walks or flies, you can put it in gumbo. And everybody tends to prefer the gumbo that she grew up with. At my house, it might be turkey and sausage after Thanksgiving. At your house, it might be crawfish in the spring. There's room for all that in gumbo. But we must acknowledge that in real-world evidence and gumbo, there are some boundaries. As much as we love y'all people from the Midwest, green beans in soup is not gumbo. Now, why are your data like your roux? You must start with the simplest ingredients. If you go to buy your roux ready-made at the store, like buying your data at the store, you don't know what they put in there. When you're making your roux, you have to pay attention, not what you can see on the top, but what's happening down on the bottom. Now, you can try to cook that roux slow, or you can cook it fast. But if you do it fast, it's riskier. And the problem is, if you stir in that roux and you see those black flecks come up from the bottom, your roux child is burnt. You cannot hide that. You cannot cover it up. You need to start over. Because anything you do after that with a burnt roux is just a waste of perfectly good seafood. Now, how much should you try to control the ingredients in your gumbo? That depends on the ingredients. Chicken and sausage are the same the world around. I hear you can even get andouille sausage in Washington, D.C. But if you're using fresh seafood in your gumbo, especially shellfish, then it matters. You don't know what you're going to get when the day comes. You get what you can catch or you get what you can find, and it does matter where it comes from and even when. Now, you can see there my partner there on the right side. You can tell from his physique that he is a gumbo expert, and he knows that you have to go down to the boat and find out. This is what we Cajuns call your intra-boat correlation, in case you thought we could not do math. And finally, the controversy. Your tomatoes is just like those observational comparisons. Sometimes they are allowed, and sometimes they are not. But it's not random. There is a logic to it. It depends on the meat you're putting in your gumbo. So if you're making your gumbo with redfish or catfish, Sometimes tomatoes work out fine. Now, if you're making your gumbo with shellfish, possibly that might be okay. But if you're making gumbo with turkey or sausage or poultry or game, you don't put tomatoes in there. That picture there, that's not okay. And if you put tomatoes in your turkey and sausage gumbo, I'm going to ask you, where all did your mama grow up? So this concludes the guidance from the Food and Drug Administration of Louisiana. I hope that at this meeting y'all can all pass a good time and come up with some recipes that are useful. Now back to our agenda. So those of you who've been involved in this series of workshops are familiar with this history, but I know some of you are new, and I want to go over that with you. Our first workshop, which happened now just about a year ago, almost a year ago, was focused on sort of barriers and orientations. If we all like the idea of real-world evidence, why isn't it happening? Why isn't it happening faster? And at least my very brief summary of what I took away from that workshop was the idea that we have in research many different traditions. Some of those traditions are quite useful, but some of them are not. The challenge for us is deciding which traditions we need to let go of, which traditions are simply adding cost or creating delay. We also spent some time talking about definitions, and I think we're able to clarify that this concept of real-world evidence often starts with something called real-world data, but it's more than that, the same way the gumbo starts with the roux. In our second workshop, we really focused on clarifying the questions, and I think we were able to focus down on questions in a few different areas. One of those key questions being, when can we rely on real-world data when we're generating evidence that's actionable, either for regulation, for business decisions, or clinical decisions? Another, when can we allow treatment to be as variable as it is in the real world, or when do we need to try to control it more? And then third, when can we rely on observational comparisons to make valid inference? Our answer, of course, to each of those questions was, it depends. There is no answer good for all times and all places for each of those questions. And our goal for this third workshop is to really try to get more specific about it depends on what. So what we will do today is revisit some of these specific questions with, as Mark said, some proposed questions, or as we call them, decision aids in mind. So our agenda for today and tomorrow, in our first session, which will start in a few minutes, we will do sort of an environmental scan and motivation, looking at where we are, where we're trying to go, and why. The sort of middle part of our agenda, sessions 2 through 4, will be really focused on whether we can generate some useful advice in some specific areas, specifically about these 4 questions. When can real-world data yield valid evidence? When and who should we blind patients and providers in pragmatic clinical trials? How much should we try to control treatment in pragmatic clinical trials? And then finally, when can we draw valid inference from observational comparisons? Our fifth session, we will hear from essentially our stakeholders or customers from FDA leadership about whether we're actually able to come up with something useful and whether our proposed questions or decision aids can actually be useful to regulators. So my ask of all of you during this meeting is to help us use specific cases to illuminate the general. You'll hear today, as we talk about each of these questions or each of these areas, we sort of tee up some specific cases, in some ways some exemplars of studies that have been completed to illustrate some of these. And I know, being a methods nerd myself in a room full of methods nerds, that there will be a temptation whenever one of these cases comes up to talk about all aspects of it, which will, of course, draw us off the topic of that session. So what we will try to do is, when we focus on those cases, and that's my second point, to stay on the topic of that session, because I think one of the things we've learned through these meetings is if we can stay focused on one of these questions, we can make progress. If instead we ping-pong around among them, we will probably end up nowhere different at the end of the meeting than we were at the beginning. We have put forward some sort of draft proposed questions. Some of you were involved in working groups over the last 2 months or so where we've revised and refined those, but they are considered in no way to be final. It's certainly possible today to rearrange, reorganize, probably not, but maybe even completely start over. But we want to encourage all of you to be creatively practical or practically creative. What we hope is that we will come away from this meeting with some suggested changes to those decision aids that will make them more useful. And then finally, the last point, I'm hoping that all of us can leave with some homework. As Mark pointed out, the national academies are not in a position to dictate or recommend what should be done, and that will not be a product of this workshop series. But those of you who participate are certainly free and even encouraged to express your opinions. And what I hope is that we might come up with some groups of people after this meeting who are able to say, we believe we have something useful to recommend, maybe not at the level of the fully articulated recipe, but at least getting close to that, and that those groups of people might then be able to speak to the field about that in a useful way. So with that as sort of the prologue, I'm ready to turn it over to our first session, session 1, which is our sort of agenda setting and background. In this session, we'll have 3 speakers. Depending on the remarks, we may or may not have time for discussion, but there'll be plenty of time for discussion later in the day. Our first speaker is Paul Johnson, who's from the National Institute for Healthcare Excellence in the UK, who'll be talking to us about the Get Real initiative at the UK and how that's operating in parallel with some of the work here in the US. Our next speaker will be Elliott Levy, who's a Senior Vice President of Global Development at Amgen, who will talk to us from both in sort of industry but also in a researcher perspective about the drivers of expense and delay in our current research process, really the sort of charge to this group of why we need to do things differently. And then Kumathi Stem, who's the Chief Executive Officer and founder of Monarch Bionetworks, will talk to us about the other new environment of real-world data, which involve data generated by free-living humans, and what that means about the future of real-world evidence development. So I'll invite Paul to come up and start, and we can ask our other panelists to come up and join. Thanks.